1982, John Belushi, the fabulous comedy star of TV's Saturday Night Live, Animal House, and The Blues Brothers, is dead at the age of 33. 1984, his story becomes a book by Bob Woodward, the prize-winning author of All the President's Men.
You know, this could be one of those stories we've always talked about, that whole Hollywood drug scene out there.
1989, The Man and the Book become the motion picture that Hollywood never wanted to be made. The life.
My God, I just watched the star of my movie.
The laughter, the loves.
I'll even marry you.
The incredible times.
I use drugs to keep myself alert to the comic possibilities in everything around me.
The truth.
You were a living legend, John. Your friend Aykroyd called you America's guest. Everybody loved you. Why did you shove a needle in your arm?
It's not just a story about the man. It's a story about America. Wired. The laughs and times of John Belushi.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Based on a True Podcast, the podcast devoted to how Hollywood talks about itself. Our first episode of 2020, our first episode in a while. It's because Bibbs and I are incredibly busy individuals. It's been hard to try to get both of us in the same room at a time that works. I am back with the fantabulous William Bibiani. Bibbs, how are you?
Well, I'm fine, thank you. I was waiting for an opening. I'm good. The end of the year was very hectic for everybody, and I felt really guilty. But here we are. We're kicking off a whole new decade based on a true podcast. Surely it'll be an entire decade filled with nothing but really classy, excellent, well-considered films just like this.
So many hits. We will be talking about nothing but box office success stories this year. Which is why we're starting it off with 1989's Wired, the unauthorized biopic of John Belushi. I'm going to let Bibbs start, because Bibbs actually was the one that recommended this. Bibbs, what is your background with this movie prior to us talking about it today?
I knew it sucked.
That's a pull quote on the poster, obviously.
By all means, please. John Belushi, of course, if anyone is even remotely hazy, was an incredibly talented comedian. Starred on Saturday Night Live, starred in Animal House and The Blues Brothers, and a few other films as well. And he died of overdose in 1933. As such, he's one of those really talented performers who died really, really young and had a legacy and had a legend. It was especially tragic that John Belushi died because he died so young. So when the time came to make a movie about him, it seemed like, oh, okay, well, that seems like a good idea. And yet absolutely nothing about Wired is a good idea. Maybe the casting of Michael Chiklis, but I'm not even convinced that's a good idea. It is a catastrophic biopic from top down, not just because it basically finger wags at John Belushi and basically shames his entire life. It's not just because it doesn't seem to have a lot of respect for him. It's that on top of all of that, on top of using John Belushi's life as a cautionary tale, which was considered very insulting by everyone who knew him, they also made a lot of really stupid storytelling choices, having a big part of the movie be John Belushi's ghost dealing with his guardian angel and playing pinball in order to try to earn a chance to live again.
Somebody saw The Seventh Seal and was like, we're going to do that, only with pinball.
And not just any pinball machine, a Blues Brothers brand pinball machine.
Branding is going to be such a big part of this episode. There are so many questionable branding things. I come at this from a somewhat different angle. If memory serves, not to date you, but you and I are different ages. I am younger than you.
Okay. It never occurred to me to ask for your age, so I actually have no idea.
I'm 30.
I'm 37, so fair enough.
I knew about John Belushi purely through how he died, as this tragedy of Hollywood, the SNL funny fat guy curse. I was more invested in when Chris Farley died, And everybody kept bringing up Belushi in comparison because those two were very similar. That's really the only reason I knew who he was. I have not seen any of his movies. I refuse to watch Animal House because I despise John Landis. And we're going to talk about John Landis in this episode. I don't know John Belushi other than the comic that everybody says is really funny that died of a speedball the way River Phoenix did. That's how I went into this. But I knew about Wired. I knew about Wired because it is one of those movies that is just often cited in the grand scheme of celebrity biopics because of how terrible it is. I know a lot of my favorite YouTubers who discuss movies have brought it up. I found out about it probably about 5 or so years ago on YouTube, and I was like, I'm never going to have to watch that movie. Thanks, Bibbs.
You bring up a really interesting point, though, which is that you're 7 years younger than me, which seems like a lot, but in the grand scheme of things, isn't really super a lot. We're part of more or less the same generation. And yet, that little thin sliver of time, less than a decade, is enough to turn an actor who had died a few days before I was born. But I still remember him and his legacy being very, very much alive because his movies were constantly on television. There were still TV specials celebrating his career. He was a very recent phenomenon throughout a lot of my childhood, and my parents were huge fans. And it's always interesting to me how being born less than 10 years later turns John Belushi from someone who is just very fresh wound for a lot of people, and a lot of people really felt the tragedy of his untimely death, into someone who is now just officially just part of Hollywood history already.
Access says so much, and we see it now with the lack of anything before 1983 being unavailable or behind a paywall. How do you access old SNL sketches anymore? NBC only puts out certain ones. So even if you wanted that Belushi history, they released DVDs, about 15 years ago?
It's been a while.
But even then, I don't even know how somebody would get into him unless you were scouring YouTube, and you certainly wouldn't have an easy time finding any of his SNL stuff because NBC likes to keep that stuff close to the vest. So it's really frustrating. It's something we're going to see even more as the paywall and the streaming wars and the lack of physical media just starts to take over.
The streaming trains people to get used to whatever is available. It doesn't really reward casual exploration. Try just going to a Netflix app on your Roku or your PS4 or your smart TV and just try searching for anything, really. It's not conducive. It's not in alphabetical order. It's not in chronological order. They just shove whatever is most recent or is most pop culturally popular right at you. If you want to find something else, good luck. You need to curate that yourself. It really sucks.
This episode is made possible thanks to the continued support of our lovely Patreon subscribers. If you'd like another way to support us, recommend us to anyone looking for classic entertainment goodness. You can also leave us a review wherever you listen to podcasts. If you aren't yet a subscriber, check out our Patreon page at patreon.com/ticklishbiz for giveaways, early access, and lots more additional bonus content.
Speaking of Wired, as Bibbs mentioned, Wired is trying to be a biopic, but it's also not a biopic because it's predominantly set in the present and immediate aftermath of John Belushi's death, played by Michael Chiklis, in his first film role, and he couldn't get a job for 18 months.
And even then, he had to work his way back up. He had a couple of TV roles that were very minor, but those were filmed after he did Wired. Everyone in Hollywood thought it was in poor taste. And now, all of a sudden, here's a guy whose first role is playing a Hollywood legend. I mean, he's not terrible in it. Ooh, that was a rough start for Michael Chiklis. It's a miracle he managed to pull himself back.
So the movie starts with him on the autopsy slab, waking up and realizing that he has died. It takes him about half the movie to realize he's died, because he keeps asking what's going on. He's very surprised. I hate movies like that, where somebody's pretty much been told, you're dead, or you're in a different location, and they're like, but what's happening? You know, stop it. He's teamed up with this film's version of Clarence, which is a guardian angel named Angel, played by Ray Sharkey, who is the every Puerto Rican stereotype that you could get.
And they give John Belushi, with this fictional Puerto Rican character, they let him say a ton of racist stuff.
So much racism. So they are going around doing It's a Wonderful Life, showing different parts of Belushi's life so haphazardly. It's fascinating. This movie came out in 1989, which was about 7 years after Belushi had actually died. The audience, this is fresh in their mind. The movie completely plays like you know every single thing about John Belushi's life because it's giving you no context about anything. Scenes just happen. And at the same time, you have this B plot line involving J.T. Walsh as Bob Woodward.
Bob Woodward from the Watergate investigation.
Writing the book Wired, that was the John Belushi biography, investigating, quote unquote, whether he really shot himself up. Okay, so this is like the Post if we were looking at the Maryland investigation, but the Washington Post was way more important than Marilyn Monroe, but also Marilyn Monroe was investigating her own death and whether the Kennedys killed her. It is the most bizarre amalgamation of things. To give some background, this movie did have some clout before it happened. It was directed by Larry Pierce, who came out of the gate in 1964 with a film called One Potato, Two Potato, that's known for being one of the earliest depictions of an interracial relationship. They actually screened it at TCM a couple years ago, and I didn't get to see it, so I was really upset about it. He dabbled in television until the late 60s, when he became known as the guy who would adapt classic literature. He directed the adaptation of Goodbye Columbus, the adaptation of A Separate Piece, and then he did The Other Side of the Mountain, parts 1 and 2, and then he did The Bell Jar. So you're just like, okay, I'm with it. And probably most famously, the year before this, he had done the 1988 TV movie Elvis and Me, which most people like me know because it had Dale McKiff in it. I keep saying that I'm going to see it one day.
That's good casting, let's just be fair.
Exactly.
Dale McKiff did Elvis.
And then he did this. And it destroyed him because he was mired in doing TV movies for the rest of his career. He tried to do a couple other things, but he ended up doing 11 episodes of Touched by an Angel. He's still around, which is amazing. This movie did not leave a lot of love lost for anybody.
Larry Pierce's direction, I'm not even sure if I've seen any of Larry Pierce's other films, and if I have, I haven't seen many. But I actually will say this for Wired. I'm going to give Wired credit for one thing. It is not your stereotypical, by-the-numbers, formulaic Hollywood biopic. It is trying, failing, but trying to change the way we tell stories about celebrities, trying to change that biopic formula, which had been in place since at least the 30s. To one extent or another, and trying to do something that was more freewheeling, that was more impressionistic, something that wasn't necessarily afraid to make the subject look terrible, and indeed it really does. That was, if nothing else, and probably nothing else, a genuinely bold choice for any biopic.
I definitely will give Larry Pierce credit for trying something new, even if it doesn't work. I do have to say, I think it does an effective job of demonizing John Belushi, even if it's at the expense of making everybody else look incredibly saintly. Everybody's still alive in Belushi's life. So this movie tries very hard to appease everybody. It desperately is sitting in the corner saying, please don't sue us, even though most of the people associated with Belushi at the time made their disquiet known.
Oh, yeah.
Jim Belushi reportedly went in to the studio where this was being filmed and destroyed an office. Dan Aykroyd, because Aykroyd's always involved anytime Belushi's name is included, made his distaste known. Everybody was very vocal about how much they did not want this movie out, and yet, for the most part, they all come out smelling like a rose.
That's really fascinating to me, and it's hard to say for certain, but I think that might have been an attempt to overcompensate and to make sure that anyone who is alive doesn't feel like they have personally been slighted, when the irony is that a lot of the people who were offended within the industry by Wired were not offended by how they would be treated by it per se, but by how it treated John Belushi, who does not come across smelling very well. Every other human being who is presented as knowing John Belushi, with the exception of the woman who confessed to giving him the speedball, is extremely overt about trying to get him to stop taking drugs.
And it's almost a little over the top.
There's a scene with his agent, who is not his real agent. His actual agent insisted his name not be used. Bill Murray insisted that he not be included in the biopic at all. John Landis even said, you can't use my real name here, although there's obviously a stand-in for him. They just don't call him John Landis. There's a ton of people. Robin Williams, Robert De Niro, they were all part of John Belushi's last days on Earth, and they're not in this at all. There's a scene with his agent where John Belushi goes to his agent and asks for cash. Mm-hmm. Very specifically cash. Why cash? Because he wants to buy a ton of drugs. He says, listen, I can't give you this. You're just going to spend it all on drugs, and the drugs are killing you. And John Belushi says, hey, man, we're not friends. We're co-workers. I don't tell you to do what to do after 6 o'clock. You don't get to tell me what I get to do in my free time. And then his agent says this line, which is so fucking corny. I couldn't believe it. I apologize for swearing. It's so corny. He says, you can't tell me not to love you.
I love that the agent is Alex Rocco from The Godfather. I was just like, why are you here? There's so many people that are just too good, and they're in this movie. And that was my big issue. Any biopic, as we've talked about on the show, has an air of bending to the truth tellers, quote unquote, who is in charge of the narrative. And that's usually whoever authorized the biography or is still alive. Here it's just so apparent. Arnie Fromson, the character that is based on Bernie Brillstein, is bad. But I also had a real issue with Lucinda Jenny, who plays Belushi's widow, Judy. When she's not just in the background reacting. Throughout the whole movie, Michael Chiklis is very open. His performance as Belushi, he's totally fine with going up to somebody and being like, I want Coke. And she's just like, oh, John, you don't need that. She's trying to placate, but also distance. When there's this whole question of he wouldn't have shot himself up, he was not into needles, it almost feels like they're trying to perpetuate this grand conspiracy that Kathy Smith allegedly murdered him, which, depending on how you interpret the story, she did go on trial for that.
She served 18 months in jail, if memory serves. There's actually an interesting documentary that came out last year about the National Enquirer.
Right, I was going to say, this is all documented in that.
There's a big part of that, and they talk about the people who were investigating that story because celebrity journalism was all they really did. They knew that she had given him the drugs, and they basically went to her hotel room with the recorder and talked to her until she said the words, I killed John Belushi. They just went at her from every different conversational angle until she actually said those words, because there's at least one perspective in which she did. Well, and then once they had that recording, they turned off the recorder and they left.
And that's really my big issue, is that the movie doesn't really delve into, and maybe this is 89 versus 2020, it doesn't delve into the idea of what the line is. They're okay with him doing cocaine openly and asking for it, and it's obvious he's an addict, but they're just not able to believe that he would shoot himself up. And there's this real issue, almost like they don't know how drug addiction works, or there's just not an interest in getting into his mind, the mind of an addict who would, at his weakest point, as most people, if you've read about the last days of John Belushi, he didn't care. He didn't care about his appearance, he didn't care about anything that he was doing. So for him to just be like, yeah, I'm going to start shooting up, I don't know if it's a 2020 thing versus a 1989 thing, but it doesn't feel like it would be that big a stretch. But the movie plays like it's odd. He was obviously held down and shot up.
It's not like there's a ton of circumstantial evidence. Mm-hmm. where, like, okay, that's a lot, and maybe we should investigate this. The evidence is mostly John was afraid of needles. She also says, his wife in the movie, that if he was in a doctor's office and a doctor had to give him a shot, he would run out of the room. There's also a scene in the movie where he's in a doctor's office telling his doctor about all the drugs he's taken, in which the doctor gives him a shot and he doesn't run out of the room.
And I love that scene where he's in the doctor's office and he's confessing openly. I smoke 3 packs a day, I do all this, and he's like, oh, well, yeah, you should probably not do cocaine. That's just how it's delivered. The deadpan, should probably not. And then if there's another scene, I don't remember if it's with Aykroyd, where he says, I think it was the cigarettes that killed him.
Right, said that.
That's my problem, is these scenes happen, and the movie, this is a quote, was supposed to show the heart of Hollywood, which was how easy it was for anybody to be a Belushi, and how this was really not just about him, it was about America.
Right. That's the line in the movie, and that's ridiculous, because that turns John Belushi's entire existence, if you want to call him an artistic genius, you could. It reduces his entire life, his friends, his impact on people to a very simple cautionary tale. But then they can't even get the cautionary tale right because they overcomplicate it within an inch of its life. You could, if you wanted to, use what happened to Belushi to explode the idea that there are a lot of artists in the industry who are encouraged, or at the very least allowed to, while everyone else looks the other way, do bad things for their health in order to keep the show running, whatever the show is. If you saw, I'm sure you did, but if anyone listening saw the biopic Judy starring Renee Zellweger, they talk a lot about how young Judy Garland was basically given pill after pill in order to make her the perfect Dorothy and as pliable as she could be as a young actor who would ordinarily be more rebellious. There's a story there, and you can really tell a story about how everyone in the industry is on some level aware that there is a significant problem with a lot of people who feel the need to, either for, you can call it for professional reasons or just for mental health reasons, because the industry is so stressful, relying on substance abuse. But the movie touches on that, and then there's this whole fantasy with all of these fantastical elements and ghosts and time travel, and none of that actually supports that message at all. And when you add the fact that Bob Woodward isn't just the author of the book, but he's a character in the movie, played by the great J.T. Walsh, an ordinarily a great actor, not good in this. He's just judging everybody.
The entire third act is Woodward and Belushi coming together as Belushi is dying. Anytime you're injecting a reporter who wrote a book into the narrative of a movie, at least, I say this having just finished Catch and Kill with Ronan Farrow, who does inject himself into that story, it's all naturally included. If they ever did that book and Ronan Farrow was a main character that actually is in the room with Weinstein victims as they're being assaulted, I'd be like, no, that's disingenuous. The thing is that Belushi throughout this movie keeps saying how much he admires Bob Woodward. He's so honored that he would want to tell his story. If I'm questioning the authenticity of a statement like that, I kept saying, is that something that Belushi said on record? Is that something that his wife said he was into? Who discovered this big obsession with Bob Woodward that John Belushi had? It plays like narrative sycophantic love to explain this character being a major part of the movie.
It's ridiculous. And listen, I wouldn't be surprised at all, because the Watergate scandal was huge. And if you want to talk about a story that injects the reporters into the narrative, All the President's Men is probably the absolute best example of it, because the investigative reporting was one of the most interesting parts of that story. If at some point in his life John Belushi had just said, you know, I really respect Bob Woodward, he did a really good thing with that Watergate story, I would be like, yeah, I'd buy that. One of the last lines in the movie, I don't think it's the last line, or at least there's a song after it. There's this bit where Bob Woodward is in the room where Belushi died, and he's imagining Belushi's last moments, which, by the way, is just cruel to watch. There's also a scene where he's being autopsied and he's alive in the middle of it, and it turns into a Saturday Night Live routine, and that's gross too. When Belushi is dying, and he can't breathe. His last words are, "Breathe for me, Woodward." And I'm like, oh, screw you. God, ew.
And in case you were curious, everybody, Bob Woodward was actually an uncredited technical advisor on this film, so he was on the set and present and probably controlled some narrative. You bring up so many things, and I don't know where exactly to start. Let's talk about Chiklis, because I only know Michael Chiklis now as Fantastic Four and The Shield. Serious, gritty, let me drop my voice 5 octaves, Michael Chiklis. This was his first film, his first major role. He tries very hard. He gained 30 pounds. I'm assuming that's an unfortunate hairpiece. He put brown contacts in to cover up the fact that he had blue eyes. He seems like he wanted to be respectful and try to pay tribute to this person. His performance is fine when I believed he was trying to be John Belushi. There were times I thought he was trying to be Sam Kinison, though, because there was so much yelling.
It was suggested at the time that Sam Kinison would have been better casting.
Oh, that would have been. He's still around. Belushi is one of those personages, unfortunately, where his look just was not distinctive enough for anybody to properly emulate, but at the same time, it helps that John Belushi doesn't have an easily identifiable set of characteristics like a Marilyn or a Judy, because I was sitting there for over an hour of the movie being like, I mean, I guess he looks like Belushi? I don't really remember what Belushi looked like. And then I had to go look on IMDb and see what he had actually looked like. It's a double-edged sword in terms of the way he looks. At the same time, is this movie, it's a musical, right?
John Belushi, in addition to being a comedian, was a musician, and of course he teamed up with Dan Aykroyd to start a very good band called the Blues Brothers. The Blues Brothers band consisted of some of the best musicians working at the time. He does a lot of numbers. Some of them are in character from Saturday Night Live. He does a song as his Bumblebee character. One of his more famous impersonations was of Joe Cocker. That's the last thing he does in the movie. And they do quite a few Blues Brothers shows. But what's interesting about all of those performances, and I want to get back to Chiklis' performance in a minute, but I want to talk about the performances that they show. None of the performances that we see in the movie are actually performances Belushi did. He never did those sketches. They couldn't get the rights to those sketches, so they didn't do songs the Blues Brothers actually did, I think with like one exception. They had to just find similar stuff. So they couldn't show the classic samurai sketch where the samurai is working in a deli, which is still one of Saturday Night Live's funnier bits. They had to make up one where the samurai was playing baseball, which is not a good sketch. But what I actually thought was interesting about those performances was that's where Chiklis is best. You talk about how you personally didn't grow up watching a lot of Belushi's stuff, which is totally fine, but I did. It was still on TV a lot. Belushi had a particular acting style. He threw himself into his physical comedy. There's a scene in this movie, which I have no idea if it's even remotely accurate in any conceivable way, but I actually do believe Belushi probably thought this to a point, that equated Belushi's comedic style to aggression. Comedy comes from aggression, and a lot of Belushi's physicality in his performances was very physically forceful. And Chiklis captured that pretty well. He is a convincing Belushi when he is in his Blues Brothers garb. He is a convincing Belushi when he is the samurai. What he is not a convincing Belushi is when he's Belushi.
The musical sequences are the only time that the movie really comes alive. The cinematography is not particularly inventive. I watched this on a really crummy YouTube copy because this movie has actually never been released on DVD and the VHS is out of print. So the only way you can watch this is through bad YouTube bootlegs. So you can't really get a feel for necessarily production design. The cinematography is very, very basic. It's just a camera shooting straight ahead that comes through clearest in these scenes where he's performing. Michael Chiklis has a good voice. He's good at doing the blues. Although I found it funny considering that a lot of the action guys in the late 80s, early 90s did fancy themselves bluesmen. Bruce Willis. So I was sitting there thinking, did this movie inspire Bruce Willis, or did Bruce Willis inspire the movie? That's worth watching. This interesting look at maybe an element of Belushi's life that he wanted to pursue. But because they can't get the rights for anything, it's this weird sense of branding, but not. They can say Saturday Night Live. They can bring up Lorraine Newman, or Dan Aykroyd is obviously a key player, which I found weird. Aykroyd lent his name to this movie. It's obvious it's him, but no one else did. I would love to know the story behind that.
I wonder if just because they were so interconnected that they couldn't come up with a compelling reason not to at least let Aykroyd let us use your name, because everyone's going to know it's you.
And that's the weird thing, is you're never sure how any of this worked out, because they can use certain things, but they can't do other things. They obviously have him filming Animal House. And they say Animal House. They bring up his movies Continental Divide. They bring up Noble Rot. But they can't actually use any of the SNL stuff.
There's a scene in the movie where his agent is telling him, and it's shortly before he died, because Belushi wasn't in that many movies. He says in the movie he was only in 7. It's 8 if you count an animated film he did a voice for. They talk about how you haven't had a hit film since Animal House, and that was in 78. And I was just like, are you not allowed to say the words The Blues Brothers movie? Because that was a hit.
We gotta talk about the Landis stuff.
Yeah.
I hate John Landis as a person. I don't want to get sued, so I'm not going to say what I want to say, but just go read Outrageous Conduct, study up on the Vic Morrow death, and you'll know why I don't like John Landis. But this movie casts somebody that, A, has a passing, if you squint, he kind of looks like John Landis in the late 80s. They're filming a movie. Belushi is just wasted, and they're arguing. It's one of those moments where he's just like, I love you so much, I want you to do good. They get into an altercation, and John Landis punches him in the face, which Landis said never happened. But I love how his response is, I just punched my leading man in the face. That's how the scene ends. I'll give Larry Pierce credit. I'd love to ask him where this came from. There's a moment where Landis is walking into the trailer, and you can hear a helicopter in the background.
That is such
a burn.
Shade. That is an enormous amount of shade right there. That's insane to me. Like, wow. John Landis is an interesting figure, directed some hit films, and with Animal House, he helped reshape American comedy for at least a decade, maybe 2, into this gross out, slovenly working class versus snobby upper class shtick, which still pops up quite often. It's a whole genre, and Animal House helped codify that. There was a really, 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 really horrible incident that happened on the set of the Twilight Zone movie. He's intrinsically linked with Belushi in a lot of ways, those early films that he did. And I will say this for not so much Landis, but for his films, he's made 3 or 4 very, very good films, and Blues Brothers was certainly one of them. It was interesting to see that very momentarily be relevant on the set. I don't know if the filmmakers of Wired have any respect for anybody unless they specifically told Belushi they loved him and told him to get off drugs.
The development of this movie is probably just as interesting as the movie is not. The book was written in 1984, and supposedly Woodward wanted to sell the rights right away, and Hollywood just was not interested because they didn't want to have to deal with confronting the real facts of how easy it is for successful stars to quickly become drug addicts. And it's something that we would unfortunately see as the 90s would continue, especially again with the death of River Phoenix a couple years later. So it was really hard trying to get the movie sold, but it did. And once it was in development, it had an even harder time because they couldn't find a distributor who would take it on. It has literally one of the smallest distributors. Taurus Entertainment is what put this out. Probably explains why it's not available on any type of digital media. The rights are probably just all over the joint. Well-known public boycotts. It screened at the 1989 Cannes Film Festival, and was supposedly booed. People despised it. Woodward actually had to do a really bad press conference where everybody kept asking him why he was in the movie. This is from Rita Kempley of the Washington Post. The silliest celebrity bio since Mommy Dearest. That's mean, because Mommy Dearest actually has really good production value.
There are actually things we can compliment about Mommy Dearest.
Oh, we could compliment many things about Mommy Dearest.
There are some films, and we point to them because they're so obvious, that developed this cult-like reputation over their badness that actually aren't bad. They're just doing their own thing, and a lot of people couldn't get on that wavelength. To an extent, you can see Wired trying to do its own thing, trying to mess with the narrative structure of a biographical motion picture, but also just sucking.
Mommy Dearest is always the easy one to point to. What Mommy Dearest has for it is a camp factor. This does not have a camp factor.
It's not fun. Worst biopics ever, the Babe Ruth story.
Oh, yeah.
You know that line from The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, Truth Becomes a Legend, Brent the Legend? Mm-hmm. That's all legend. That's all stupid Babe Ruth stuff about how he cured cancer by hitting a home run, how maybe they're going to cure Babe Ruth's life-threatening illness even though he died right after the movie. It's all him accidentally winding his way into a Broadway musical and then doing the musical number and being charming. All of that stuff is crap. None of that is true. It's all just this hero worship. However, if you love Babe Ruth, or if at the very least you love baseball or history, or that's Americana, the mythologizing of American figures, there's an entertainment value to it. Nothing in Wired is particularly watchable.
No, and the movie tried to sell itself off of notoriety. There is a huge thing in the producer, Edward Feldman, his book. He actually has a whole section devoted to this movie and how there was this belief that Michael Ovitz, who at the time worked for CAA and had represented Belushi, he said it was Michael Ovitz, Aykroyd, and Bill Murray used their influence to sabotage the distribution of the film. Much like the movie presents this grand conspiracy about Belushi maybe being murdered, the movie sold itself on this belief that it was this film that was just so dangerous. It was being stopped by all these powerful people. That's not true. Executives claimed that it was just because the movie was not good. And even Bernie Brillstein said that they were using this as a way of getting the movie more attention. He said, quote, "The only thing that the producers have to hang on to is the image of Wired as the movie that Hollywood tried to stop."
Work with what you got when that's the only publicity you have. Spend all this money on the movie. You gotta try to make it back somehow. I'm not entirely unsympathetic. When you're a distributor and the movie that you've got is terrible, offensive, most of the pertinent people involved think that it misrepresents the facts of a life that you're trying to encourage people to explore and celebrate through your film, what are you going to do with that?
You brought up the offensive stuff. We haven't even touched on just the racism that this movie has. I knew I was in for a hard sit when we literally introduced Ray Sharkey's Angel Velasquez, our guardian angel. Is Ray Sharkey at all Latino? Irish and Italian. No, he's not. Okay, we have a white and Italian guy playing a Puerto Rican. He talks like Speedy Gonzalez. He drops random phrases in Spanish because he's so Puerto Rican. He tells Belushi when they first meet in the cab, "You should be lucky people cared about you and you were on Saturday Night Live. I was just some dude that died in the Central Park Zoo." And I was just like, oh, so you're a man of color that died of a drug overdose. Great.
There's this brief moment where there is that line, and you think that maybe the reason they introduced this character was to provide some sense of context. Oh, poor, woe is me, rich, successful, celebrated performer. If you put them next to someone who had real life problems, maybe they would have a certain sense of grander understanding over the larger context of their life. I'm not saying that's necessarily a good idea in this movie, but for a second you think at least there's a purpose. There's none. He's not there to actually provide a meaningful counterpoint after that line. The choice of what character that is doesn't really contribute anything. There's no reason for him to have a guardian angel at all, but if you absolutely must, why this guy? Why this fictional guy who only exists so that John Belushi wasn't even alive to say any of this stuff, could say horribly racist things, and then just go about his supernatural business? Why? Why are these decisions being made?
Let's not forget, this is 6 years after Scarface, the remake. Ray Sharkey's just playing the character like Tony Montana. Everything is Mang. I'm just like, stop it, please. But you bring up a good point. Do we even know if John Belushi was particularly religious? That's what I was really into. The concept of a guardian angel and this whole idea of, is this heaven or hell? I was like, what if John Belushi wasn't religious at all? I'd be more irritated that I am here with this guardian angel that's dealing in some Judeo-Christian stuff that I'm not really into.
I know his family was. Based on my research, he was born to Albanian-American parents. His brother, Jim, of course, went on to have a larger career, and they stayed right the fuck away from Jim. They did not put Jim in the movie at all. They were smart to do so. He apparently was buried at a religious service. Whether that was more for the family than it was for Belushi, I cannot say. But there is some basis to suggest that he did have at least a religious upbringing.
We're bringing up regularly that this movie does not get under the skin of who this character is.
Yeah.
It just presents things. And so when he's on the slab being autopsied, his Asian doctor is being portrayed as a samurai or a sushi chef. What does this mean? What does it mean?
Well, for a second I thought maybe that was karma, because one of Belushi's most famous comedic characters was him
Very true.
being a Japanese samurai, and it was like, well, this is what you get. Because there's an argument to be made in this film that he's not just looking over his life like a Christmas Carol. There's an argument to be made that he might actually be in hell. This is a nightmare scenario for him. He's not having these beautiful come-to-God moments. There's one scene where he's in a movie theater and they're showing, I think, Animal House, and people are laughing. This isn't about him coming to terms with his complicated life or his addiction or his choices or his relationships to his family or his coworkers or other artists or to his audience. It's not really about that. It's just the movie just saying drugs are bad. Hollywood was bad for the drugs, except a lot of people in Hollywood maybe didn't handle it right, but they were totally anti-drug. So I guess really it's not that big a problem at all. But Bob Woodward sure thinks so, and he was great. Boy, I love you, Bob Woodward. Thanks, Bob Woodward, for showing us the way. Here's your check, Bob Woodward.
God forbid Bob Woodward ever hears about our podcast. I'm assuming Bob Woodward is a fan. 4 years later, River Phoenix would die of pretty much the same thing.
Yeah.
And then a couple years later, you'd have Chris Farley dying of pretty much the exact same thing. Watching a movie like Wired with its preachiness and knowing what would happen afterwards. Real life is the far better, unfortunate story of what this movie thinks it's saying.
I mean, listen, if you want to tell a story about how Hollywood takes young artists and chews them up and forces them to resort to unhealthy coping mechanisms just to succeed, or at least that's what they are led to believe is necessary, there's more context you need than just Belushi's life. I'm not saying this is a good idea. This is a terrible idea, but if they wanted to keep this whole guardian angel thing and have it be relevant and keep this whole storyline about Hollywood, what if you made his guardian angel one of the many other actors who died too young for similar reasons?
Just do what Wayne's World 2 did and make it Jim Morrison.
That would have been plausible. That would have been a thing. Like, you could have done that. And arguably would have also been in bad taste, but at the very least, artistically, it would have meant something.
This movie falls into a very interesting sphere in the biopic world. It's not garish enough to be a mommy dearest, I'm going to say it's not offensive enough to be like a Larry Buchanan level of biopic, like a Goodbye Norma Jean, or like Harlow and Hughes, Angels in Hell. It's not The Haunting of Sharon Tate.
It's not like a hit piece, and it's not mega exploitative, but I feel like it comes close. And I think the thing that keeps it from going over is, and I think this is in some respects to the film's detriment, but I also think tonally it might have been an intentional choice. Chiklis's performance as Belushi, he plays Belushi as a lost puppy dog. He plays Belushi even in his harshest scenes, where Belushi is really making himself look like an a-hole. He clearly sympathizes with Belushi and plays him in a way he wants the audience to want to take care of him.
That scene with the wife where they're on the beach, that's a very sweet sequence, and I would have loved some development on that. It's a scene that just ends and then it cuts to something completely different in tone. Chiklis is playing one thing and the movie is just playing something completely different.
That might have been a calculated attempt so that the unrepentant hit piece darkness of the rest of the movie could have a counterpoint in how sympathetic Chiklis was playing Belushi. And I think the irony here is that in doing this, whether it was intentional or otherwise, is it makes his portrayal of Belushi feel pretty two-dimensional, as though he's nothing more than a plaything or a pawn in this true Hollywood story of reefer madness.
Thankfully, we have a chance to get it right again, because I did not know this until literally just now. According to MovieWeb, in December of 2019, they greenlit a new Belushi biopic.
Yeah, I had heard something to that effect. Who was they getting to star in that?
They are getting Alex Brightman, who you might know from various Broadway shows, including, he's the Beetlejuice guy, right?
I actually don't know.
I'm thinking he is. He's the Beetlejuice guy, who I think is also the School of Rock guy. Somebody could tell me those are two different actors. So he will play John Belushi in a film that has been in development hell for a long time, dubbed simply Belushi. It's going to be directed by the Devil Wears Prada director David Frankel.
Interesting choice.
That sounds all sorts of promising. That's all we know. It's not every day you get a performer that has not been biopicked, pun intended, to death. We've talked about how many Marilyn movies there are. We know how many Judy movies there are. You don't get to be a figure that has so many different versions. Maybe the time is now to do a new Belushi movie. There's enough time that's passed that you're still going to irritate the same people. Aykroyd's still going to be pissed.
The other biographies of Belushi that weren't nearly as lambasted by those people, and some of them were actually contributed to and supported by those people. So depending on what they base it on, maybe they will have that support.
There's been enough distance in terms of how we look at drug addiction, at how we look at celebrity, that we can have something at the bare minimum that's more nuanced, that has some production, that has some gravitas. Don't get me wrong, David Frankel is not exactly the guy that I'd be asking to helm my Belushi biopic. What has he really been doing with his time? He's been doing television shows and 2016's Collateral Beauty.
Ew.
Oh, yeah.
Oh.
Give that guy your Belushi story.
Ew.
He also did the Anna Delvey TV series.
He did The Big Year, in which Jack Black, Owen Wilson, and Steve Martin did bird watching. Remember when they were bird watching?
No, I do not remember when they were bird watching.
I totally believe you, because it wasn't very memorable. He also did Marley and Me.
I was going to say Marley and Me. Oh, God.
Marley and Me it's manipulative, but it is fine. It is well made.
David Frankel is a great guy if you want emotional manipulation.
A lot of the biopics that we're getting right now, and of course I'm thinking specifically of Bohemian Rhapsody, which got away with it even though it is completely incompetent, is it's basically just, hey, you like the music, right? We're going to show you how it was cool. And then we're going to tack on a pretty crazy melodrama on top of that.
There is no better time right now, I think, to be a biopic.
Yeah.
Bohemian Rhapsody, Rocket Man. We have another Marilyn movie coming out this year.
We have an Aretha Franklin movie, with Jennifer Hudson. I saw that preview in front of Cats, and I'm just like, oh, yeah, you totally need to do that right now while Jennifer Hudson's just right for it. I'd be disappointed if you didn't do an Aretha Franklin movie right now.
And yet Hollywood is still not greenlit my John Garfield biopic, so I'm very... Once again, another year of being failed in my desire to have that turned into a film.
This movie is not available on home video. It was briefly released on VHS. Apparently, if you look carefully, it's one of the VHSs Jerry Seinfeld had in his apartment in the sitcom Seinfeld, which, if you needed another reason to think that that character was an a-hole, boom, you liked it enough to own it. Sometimes there are movies that are notorious or bad or just weird, and you tell people, I'm telling you right now, it's not good, but you want to see this for novelty value. I'm going to tell you this right now. You can use your own judgment. I'll never judge you. If you want to see Wired, knock yourself out. You really don't have to. And I think everyone involved in the movie would probably rather you didn't.
I can't say this is one of the worst movies that I've seen because I didn't even like it that bad to have a visceral reaction. I just kept saying, God, this movie's terrible.
Yeah.
But it didn't make me angry.
Maybe if you knew Belushi personally, or if you had grown up with his films, you might have been more offended. That fades over time a little bit. And instead what we're left with is, I don't understand any single one of these creative choices. They are not making Belushi look good, and they're making it seem like the only real reason to tell a story about his life is because he died. That right there is the ultimate condemnation of Wired. You can talk about the performances, you can talk about the writing, you can talk about the controversy, you can talk about the shift in tone, but what it boils down to is the movie doesn't illuminate anything about Belushi, and the only thing it really seems to care about is the fact that he died and drugs are bad, and that is a waste of a biopic of John Belushi.
This is a movie that exists purely because it had been enough time that had passed that we were like, let's just do something and capitalize on it. I'll be interested to see if the new biopic ever comes to fruition, if this will finally get a DVD release.
The way that home video releases are going right now is there's a lot of niche and novelty houses that are doing a very good job of just keeping things alive. So I would not be surprised if Wired one day gets picked up for distribution by like a smaller label like Kino or even something like weird like Vinegar Syndrome, and they just pick this up, clean it up a little bit, maybe do an interview with the director, and then just dump it on there for posterity. For posterity, it's there and it can be seen.
I was going to say, the only reason to watch this is posterity. That's Wired. That's a good way to set up our 2020 season of Based on a True podcast. That's going to close us out. Thank you for continuing to support us. If you're listening to this, it's probably because you're a patron. And we thank you for your support of the show so that we can keep doing episodes like this. Where can fans find get in touch with you? What's going on with your numerous outside projects?
I'm on Twitter at William Bibiani, and you can find my podcast network, which I co-host with fellow film critic Whitney Seibold, the Critically Acclaimed Network. You can find that on Twitter at Critic Acclaim. You can find it on Patreon at patreon.com/Critically Acclaimed Network, where you get a ton of exclusive bonus content. I'll tell you about that in a second. The Critically Acclaimed Network is a whole series of shows that are hosted by the two of us. They include our flagship show, Critically Acclaimed, where we review new movies. There's a show called We've Got Mail, where we answer our listeners' mail, and we talk about the history of cinema, where to get started on big directors, movie recommendations, talking about the various controversies of the day. We have Canceled Too Soon, where we review TV shows that lasted only one season or less. And we're also going to be adding a new show, which we haven't found the right title yet, but it will be debuting really, really soon, where we're going to do probably about 20, 25 episodes, where every episode of the podcast we're looking at a different film that influenced Star Wars. And then once we're done with Star Wars, we're probably going to move on to another big pop culture milestone, look at every movie that influenced the movies everybody knows, whether or not they know the movies that influenced them. So I'm really looking forward to getting started on that. And then over on the Patreon, patreon.com/Critically Acclaimed Network, We have exclusive shows in which we're reviewing every single nominee for Best Picture in chronological order. We're reviewing every single Star Trek episode in production order, which is slightly different. We're doing all kinds of stuff over there, and we hope you pop on by and enjoy it. Thank you.
And then, of course, you are already following the podcast on Twitter at ticklish_biz, where you can find out about what's coming up next. Please be sure to listen to the latest episode, which we've done our 2019 classic film discoveries. I'm sure there's other things by the time this comes out, because as you can tell, I'm going to probably be editing this after everything else. If you want to follow me, I'm on Twitter at journeys_film. Till then,